So my name is Sharon Sarai, and I'm the Training Delivery Manager for Thornfields. I also have the privilege of being ILM Centre Manager for the business, a job that I passionately love. Thornfields, as you know, is part of the FPM group, which I'm confident that some of you will be aware of. We've had some really good sessions with Phil. Phil, do you just want to give a wave? Yeah.
Well, hero.
Yeah, our heroes. Yeah, and we all need a hero in our life, and especially an accountant. So it gives me great delight to welcome Phil Harnby. He's a friend to Thornfields and he works closely with us. Now, Phil looks after many practices up and down the country, and I know he particularly likes enjoying the engagement between practice managers that he meets with. This short time together, which is 20 minutes presentation and 20 minutes for questions at the end, is something that we would like to do on a regular basis. It's about giving something back to you guys working so hard in general practice. And finance is one of those subjects that we really need to get on top of, especially with the climate as it is now. So before we start, just some housekeeping to keep us on track. This session is being recorded. If you have any questions, please feel free to add them to the chat facility. And if we don't get through them all, we'll certainly come back to you with a follow-up guide and also the recording. It'll go out to all attendees. So I know you're on mute, but I would just like to welcome Helen. Helen, do you want to just give a wave? So Helen is our National Account Executive, and she just wants to say hello and share a little bit of news. Helen?
Yes, thank you, Sharon. Hello, everybody. I've just come on today to let you know about a course that we're running shortly, because obviously everybody here is interested in the finance aspect of things. You might have received an email already, but it's just to remind you that we have an annual finance and contract update workshop that's just recently been updated with the new information that's been released for this year's contract. It's £85 plus VAT per person, and it's going to be held virtually on the 9th of June. So I'm going to put the information about that in the chat, and if anybody wants to book on that course, then you can get in touch directly with me or through the web form, which you can get to from the web page. So that was just a reminder about that. Thank you, Sharon.
Oh, lovely. Thank you, Helen. Sounds a good session. So, Bill, over to you.
Thank you very much. I've just worked out that this because I'm sad like this, but I've just worked out that £85 plus the VAT, the net cost after pension and tax deductions is £31. So a bit of a bargain. I'm not running that course, by the way, just so I'm not benefiting from that at all. So good morning, everyone. My name is Phil Harnby. As I've never been called a hero in accounting before. That's definitely a phrase I may coin for the future. But I'm a chartered accountant. Before we get into the presentation, as is always the case, I think it's always worth reminding everyone that I'm not giving advice this morning. We're having a nice chat over a cup of tea or coffee. But obviously, if you want to engage our services, you're more than welcome to do so. So as I said, I'm a chartered accountant. I've been a chartered accountant for a number of years now. The firm that I'm part of is a firm called Mitchell's Grievson. We're based up in County Durham, but as Sharon said, we do look after clients across the whole of the UK. We're a general practice, but we do specialise in the healthcare sector, and I personally have now, for over 10 years, specifically looked after doctors, GPs, practice managers, locums, consultants, dentists, people like that. So a bit of a broad area, and we're here this morning to talk about partnership issues and disputes. And in case I forget later on, if you are going to put any questions in the comments area or the chat facility, please don't use people's names. We don't want this to be dragged into a dispute you're involved in at the moment. Certainly happy to talk around scenarios, but certainly don't want to say we've fallen out with Dr. X. That probably wouldn't be particularly brilliant. So to start off, the best way is to avoid it. So if we just avoid the disputes in the first instance, we don't have a problem and we can all move on. So should we just end there? We'll just avoid disputes. Sadly, I think that is unlikely to be the case all the way through everyone's career. So we're going to kind of talk about different areas where we can have disputes, some particular things we can maybe do to avoid them, and then as Sharon said at the very end, we'll have any questions to cover any points that I've potentially not hit on. So the majority of issues and disputes that we tend to find within partnerships is the partners themselves. We're all very good at getting along with each other most of the time, and you know, Sharon and I were talking earlier that we get on quite well, but you know, we might differ on certain subjects because we're different people, and that is the same with your partners. And if you've got a partnership of 2 or a partnership of 20, you are all different individuals and have a different position in life. So if you've got someone who's just had a new young family and they've got young kids at home compared to someone who's about to retire, understandably they're going to have different directions, and most of the time we would like to think that we can find some compromise and move forward, but sometimes we don't. But the fundamental document that kind of tries to prevent us from falling out is our partnership agreement. And we've already done a bit of a presentation on partnership agreements previously, and you might want to kind of shoot back to that one to have a look. But the partnership agreement is a really fundamental document, and I actually this morning, because again I'm a bit sad, went and found mine just to make sure I still had a copy. I signed it over 5 years ago now and have never looked at it since, so it did take a bit of looking, but it is there. And that document protects me and protects my partner if something was to happen. Or at the same time, if we fall out about something, how do we go about resolving that? And you sign that document before you join the partnership, before the partnership forms, and you look back at that if you have a dispute. Because if you're not falling out and you decide actually fundamentally we're going to do something different, well, you don't have to go back and look at the partnership agreement necessarily if you're all agreeing that you're going to do that. But if you do fall out, then it's going back to that. And the major concern that you potentially have is if you don't have an agreement, you fall back on the Partnership Act from 1890, and that's the year 1890, and the world was definitely a very different place back in 1890, and there are very few protections for partners within that, certainly within the medical setting. So definitely the key for partnerships is that partnership agreement. And what does that mean? Well, it means you're all joined by law, so you're backed up by law. So if you stop following that document, the law can step in and say, no, hang on a second, you've agreed that's what you're going to do. And it should also have in some clauses about how to resolve disputes. So if there is an issue, what do? You go back, you have a look at that clause, and it will often, and we'll come on to things like property in a couple of slides time, but it will often have in, you know, this is what you do if you don't agree on something. And us chartered accountants tend to shudder when it comes to certain things. So it often says, and speak to your accountant. So we tend to get dragged into disputes where we wouldn't necessarily want to be, but it is there as a document to give you some reassurance and some support. And it's important that you follow it. So if you are in the midst of a dispute, you've got to follow what's in that document, and you've got to follow that process through. So how do we avoid in these circumstances? We've got our partnership agreement. We're all on board. We're happy with that. But there is an issue. Well, or there's a potential for some issues. Well, I think the best way, certainly in the partnership environment, is for having regular meetings. You know, having a monthly meeting, even potentially a weekly meeting that everybody attends. So no one can turn around and say, well, I wasn't aware of that. Nobody told me. I didn't know that was going to happen. Well, if everyone's meeting regularly, discussing things, you're chatting things through, you're talking about where you're coming from, then in fairness, most disputes never become disputes because you agree to disagree, or you thrash it through in a meeting and agree, yeah, in these circumstances we're going to go down that route. And what I've seen often is that these meetings happen, around the lunchtime. Everyone kind of sits around having the sandwiches, chatting these things through, but not everyone turns up. And then things are agreed and discussed in those little groups of people that now necessarily the partnership as a whole. So making sure that people attend. And what I mean by no strong personalities, I don't mean we've got to get rid of them, but you've got to manage those people. And I'm sure we can all sit back in our own practices and think about who those strong personalities potentially are. But it's about making sure that they're not just driving the conversation. And in reality, the other 9 partners want to go that way, but this person that has the strongest voice or the strongest opinion is pushing the practice in a different way. So being able to manage those circumstances. And I think as well, and one of the questions that we got in beforehand was about, well, how do I make sure that the partners know what's going on? Well, what we call in accounting circles, management information, just info about what's going on. Because if the partners know what things like the cash balance are in the bank account, they can't be upset if it's not where they thought it should be. Also gives them the opportunity to look at something and say, well, hang on a second, I thought we had 100 grand in the bank. Why do we just have 20? And it enables that conversation to progress and know that is happening. And I've dealt with a partnership in the not so distant past, that their cash balances have progressively done that over time. We've picked them up as a new client and gone, well, what's happening? And none of the partners in the room knew. And actually, if they'd been told at a regular meeting, right, our cash balance is 200,000, it's now 150, it's now 100, it's now 50, we're now calling the bank for an overdraft. Well, that can cause disputes because, hang on a second, why has that happened? You've taken out more than you should have done, or you've done this that you shouldn't have done, you've stopped doing this. Well, if we're having those discussions, if we're having those chats, that doesn't become a problem because it's been addressed at an earlier point. I think I should caveat that I'm not guaranteeing by doing those things you will never have a falling out. These things still happen, but I think it's putting those things in place to try and head things off before they become a problem. So staffing, and apologies if this is your practice. I googled GP practice staff, and this was the first image in Google Images. So apologies if it is your practice staff picture. But you all look very happy, so I'm sure none of you are going to fall out anytime soon. But I think again, staffing tends to cause challenges, both from within the staffing team and also from management looking at that staffing team. And again, I'm a big believer in dialogue. And if you tell the staff what you're doing and why you're doing it and how it's for the greater good, they generally tend to be bought into that, and they generally want to be part of the process and don't become the thorn in the side of the surgery or the person causing issues. What is fundamentally important though with staffing is good HR support, and I know Thornfields offer that through the services that they do, and having that good support, having that person in your room to say, right, I've got this situation here, what do we need to think about, can stop issues coming out of staffing. Because if we look at a GP practice as a whole, your biggest cost and your biggest asset is the staff, and getting that bit right, and if it's wrong, can cause huge issues both with the delivery of service and care, along with just the ability of the practice to function. So having that support there, and that then leads down to the same as we had with our partners, good contracts. And does everyone have a contract? And does everyone know what they should be doing? Job descriptions and those kinds of things that again should head off a dispute. But if you do end up in a dispute, you absolutely want to make sure you've got that good HR support behind you to ensure that the practice as a whole doesn't come afoul. So the big dispute we tend to find in partnerships themselves is property. And again, it was the first Google image picture of a GP surgery. So if it's yours, it looks very nice, well done. If it's not, then there's potentially something to aspire towards. But the valuation of property, and we've got to remember that GP practice properties are significantly more valuable than the commercial premises next door. Yeah, and that's due to notional rent and NHS England and all those kinds of good things. But that, you know, the bigger the number, the bigger the possibility of falling out. And it generally tends to come when partners are joining, partners are leaving, because that's when we're looking at getting a valuation. And you know, formal valuations are an opinion. And I've had a number of practices over the years where you get two valuers from two independent valuing, you know, registered valuers, and they're pulls apart. And you tend to fall out at that point because the person selling wants the big number, the person buying in obviously wants the smaller number, and where do we come to an agreement with that? Normally your partnership agreement will tell you if you can't agree on that number, well, let's go and have a look in the partnership agreement, and be careful of the costs that can potentially ensue, because it might just say get a third value. So if you then get a third valuation, well, does that necessarily help the situation? There's potentially additional costs in there. You know, you might be better off trying to come to some kind of agreement. And as I said, that sale and purchase element of property can become complex. And I think as well, I was saying before about, you know, kind of different people in different parts of their lives. You know, if you're a 65-year-old partner with at least one eye, if not both eyes, on retirement, you probably have a different opinion of the property than a 35-year-old partner who's just joined that's going to work there for the next 20 years. So, you know, that can cause issues when it comes to things like, do we do some renovation works? Do we improve reception? Do we change around the rooms? So again, thinking those things through and what different people are wanting from different environments, I think is important to consider. And one thing that's comparatively new, in the sense of there's been partnerships for an awful long time, we've had staffing for an awful long time, and property's been around since the dawn of time. PCNs, thinking back, they were established on the 1st of July 2019, so quite a while ago now. But I think we're now starting to see some of the issues that are coming out of those organisations. And if we think back to 2019, there was, you know, everyone signed up, everybody joined the PCN because it was beneficial to do so. We all had to do it by a set date, otherwise there was potential financial penalties. So we all just did it. We all just signed up, and we weren't quite sure what we're signing up to, but you know, euphoria was driving us on. What we're generally finding now is that I'm not quite convinced everyone signed up to the same thing, and we're not all on the same page. So some of us think we signed up to this, some of us think we signed up to that, and they're doing that. It's important to again review what's in the PCN agreement. Is that what we thought we signed up to? Do we need to review that? And I've got a couple of PCN clients myself, and we are starting to see those divergences of what we thought we were signing up for. And you know, it's not unsurprising, given, you know, there's 1,250 networks that have started. You know, there's 48,000 patients on average. They're big organisations, and there's quite a few of them. So it's not unlikely for those issues to start to come through. And if we think we've got issues in two-partner partnerships, so some partners are happily fall out with themselves, but certainly if we can have issues in two-partner partners, if we've now got PCNs with 150 members effectively, you're not definitely going to all be on the same page, and try to iron those issues out and resolve that, while at the same time we're delivering service and all the additional rules that are coming through, etc. That can add a lot of pressure to what's happening. So back to kind of that very first question about how do we avoid it. I think I've managed to sum it up, and as I said, this isn't a cast iron, definitely magic wand moment, but I think, you know, keeping good records is really important. You know, and looking at and you know, whether that be the partnership agreement and minutes of meetings, or it's the staffing contracts, or it's the PCN agreement, or it's the property valuations, keeping that information to hand, having it, knowing you know who it involves, who's potentially going to have issues with anything, you know, what could the issues be, and why would there be some issues. And I think keeping that record, you know, those records together, also enables you to turn back, because I've had plenty of partners that will agree something today, and in 18 months swear blind they didn't. But if you've got some minutes that say, no, you did agree that was what was discussed, I've even got what you said at the time, then there's no disputing it. And I think that record keeping works. But if we can't avoid it, and if we're on this precipice of does the bus go over the edge or does it not, and frustrating, we never found out, did we, in the Italian Job film? But if we are on that, being able to go back to those records, what was discussed, and seeking advice, going away and speaking to your accountant, speaking to Thornfield, speaking to your lawyer, potentially as well, just ensures that if we're not going to avoid a dispute, is there anything that I can do to avoid, huge issues further down the line, employment tribunals or proper fallings out amongst partners, where people stop talking to each other. And I think whenever you end up in a dispute, and I quite like this symbol, and it was told to me many moons ago that a good end of a problem like this is that nobody's happy. And as long as we're all equally unhappy, then that's probably the right outcome. And we do have these kind of opposing views. Well, I want to go that way. Well, I want to go that way. Well, in the middle somewhere is the compromise. And if we're open to compromise from the very outset, then in fairness, we can avoid a lot of disputes in the process. Because it's important to remember that as soon as you start to, engage legal processes, they are very expensive. And most lawyers will tell you that as well. That if you can avoid ending up in front of a tribunal or a court, that's probably financially a good outcome. So at this juncture, then, do we have any questions? And I'll just reiterate what I mentioned at the beginning about, if you do put anything in the chat, please don't use people's names. That's probably not where we would want to be. But if anyone has any kind of questions, and just I'll reiterate, I'm not a lawyer, so I can talk around the financial side of things, but certainly can't go down the legal side.
Just got somebody waiting.
So yes, where there is no partnership agreement and there is a dispute. So yeah, absolutely. You are technically called a partnership at will that falls within the 1890 Act, and the 1890 Act effectively says you share everything equally. So it's not particularly helpful. It's about one side of A4. That's about all that it says. You're then in a very sticky wicket that in that you've got to agree and you've got to compromise to progress things forward. And if you can't agree and you can't compromise, the nuclear option is the dissolution of the partnership, and that effectively means the partnership ceases. And that has serious repercussions for the partners, because you've got staff, so you'd have to make all of your staff redundant. If there's property involved, the property has to be sold. The contract has to be potentially handed back to NHS England. There is a lot of issues if you get down that route, and if you are at the point where nobody can compromise, you need to be having conversations with a lawyer, a firm of solicitors, to discuss how you can take things forward before somebody tries to go down the dissolution route. Now that might be the right route. It could be there is no other option, but there's a lot of pain for the partners on both sides of the dispute if that was to happen. So you definitely need to be cautious when there's no partnership agreement there. And if you haven't fallen out, the best thing you do is put a partnership agreement in place. It's one of those documents, a bit like my one, that you spend a couple of £1,000 on and hope you never need to spend. But if you did need to have a look at it and there is a problem, it's the best couple of £1,000 you will have ever spent. So sometimes it is worth spending the money up front. So how soon do you need to start an agreement when a partner hands in the notice? Well, it depends. So if a partner's leaving, there's potentially no change to the partnership agreement, because it's just then, somebody leaving. It's potentially when somebody new is coming in that they need to be signing up to that agreement. What's important to remember is that if they've not signed anything, you then become a partnership at will by default, because they've not signed the agreement. So if you've not got a partnership agreement with the new 4 partners rather than the old 4 partners, then that partnership doesn't exist anymore. So it's important that that agreement is signed prior to that new person becoming a partner. Now, the handing in the notice part of the agreement, well, they've within the partnership agreement, it will tell you how that process should work. And I have seen it before where, you know, you've got to have handed in your notice within 6 months to the practice manager. I've seen partners stood outside practice managers' doors waiting to hand that notice in. I'm not sure whether that's because they're excited to retire or excited to leave the partnership. But either which way, the partnership agreement should say how retirements work, how admittance of new partners work. But you've got to remember, as soon as that new partners are admitted, they need to have signed that document and be happy with it. Otherwise, it's not that partnership anymore because they're not a party to it. So yes, if the partnership agreement says the agreement's by majority vote, then that's how it works. So that's the agreement they all came to. And I think what you've often got to remember with agreements is you signed the partnership agreement when you were happy and you all got on and you were all friendly, and therefore it's the fallback position. And I think most partnerships managed for periods of time at least to not need to go to formal processes as to how it's going to work, and we can kind of effectively do things on the nod. So do we all agree to do that? Yeah, there's no dispute. Right, happy to move on. If you end up going down the voting route, you've then almost got to make sure that everyone's happy with that, and that okay, that you know 1, 2, 3, how many individuals didn't get their own way, but that's life, and we don't always get our own way all of the time, and sometimes there's a little bit of ego rubbing to reassure those people that it's not personal, it's just I think this is the right decision for the organisation. And again, it comes back to that discussion and dialogue and views, and 9 times out of 10 we are going to be heading in the same direction, but every so often, I, for instance, didn't choose the colour of my office, but I can live with it. It's not offensive. It's perfectly fine. But we took a staff vote, and grey, two-tone grey, it's like living in a battleship, was the deciding factor. But in the bigger picture of things, it's absolutely fine. It's about that kind of compromise and thinking things through. So yeah, so Sharon's put an interesting one in there. If we suspect someone of being dishonest, and that's a really tough one. If we have concerns about what an individual does, and I suppose it depends on what that dishonesty is. And obviously in the healthcare sector, it could be quite. We've seen those cases before where people have done bad things with medical records and looked up friends and things like that, which has serious consequences. And practices need to be very, very careful that they handle those things properly. Now, if it's a HR issue, so it's a member of staff that we're worried about, and it could just be we think someone's taken £20 out of the petty cash tin. If it's a HR issue, then absolutely you should be involving a HR department, whether that be Thornfields or the one you already use. But I think having that kind of reassurance from day one, and removing the future risk. So if the cash tin is just sat under the front desk in reception, it probably isn't the right place for the cash tin to be sat. And we should. Sharon has kindly reiterated, the misappropriation of cash and fraud, which if it's small things like the petty cash tin, then absolutely do something sensible with it, move it somewhere. What you tend to find is we're probably going to look in the next few weeks about doing a session like this about controls and financial controls in particular. I think what we've often got to be careful of is that type of fraud tends to come through opportunity and a need. So we haven't brought our lunch money in today, or there's some financial pressures at home because of redundancy or illness or something like that. The petty cash tin is there. I'll just borrow £20. I promise I'll put it back. And you never do, because the next week you then borrow another 20 and it escalates. So I think absolutely on that small scale, removing the risk is the best thing to do, and giving that responsibility to an individual. So if it's always Margaret on reception looks after the petty cash, if it's wrong, it can only be Margaret that we need to go and have a conversation with. Where if it's an open tin in an open plan office, well, it could be any one of 100 people that could have potentially taken it. On the bigger scale of things, well, you've got to be really, really careful. Most practice managers have a pretty open access to everything, and understandably so in most practices. But again, if there's that potential opportunity, and I have looked after a practice that had £120,000 stolen from it over the course of 6 months, and it was only found out because we, as the external accountants, were badgering for the information, and eventually it arrived and it was clear there was a rabbit away. That person served time. They eventually got locked up, and again, keeping good records, having that right management information. If that practice if the partners had looked at anything, it probably would have been caught a little bit earlier, but it was purely taken out so quickly and in such a short space of time. It was before the external accountants ourselves got any information from the practice, where if the partners had kind of looked at bank statements or even kind of queried what checks they were signing, they might have caught it a bit sooner. And of course, we've got to remember that things like fraud are a crime. Yeah. So if you know, and okay, fair enough, you might want to deal with £20 going from the petty cash tin internally. But if it's someone that's stolen, you know, not insignificant sums of money or even relatively small sums of money, you don't necessarily want to pass that problem to somebody else. So you might discipline them, they leave and they go on to other employment. Well, they could just be repeating that exercise elsewhere, and they repeat it before they get to yourself. So, you know, that kind of issue, I think should be dealt with appropriately at the time. No, I don't think there's any more questions that we've got. We will, if there is, just by all means put them in the chat at the bottom. We do have a couple more. As I said, we're going to add one on potentially around financial controls, which I think is probably off the back of this one, maybe a sensible thing to kind of follow up with. But if there is anything else, if there is it won't be just yourself that has a burning desire to discuss something. So by all means, if you drop either phone fields, or I'll leave our email address up there as well, if you want to either drop either as an email, or if you've got any kind of follow-ups to this, we will, as we have done with the other presentations if you've been before. Yeah, limited companies and PCNs, I shall write that down. So if we're going to, off the back of this, we'll do another pack as we've done on the previous presentations, and we'll get that sent out to everybody. And I believe if you want to kind of listen to this again, if you've got insomnia this evening, it'll be on YouTube as well, if you want to follow that up. But no, I'll jot down the limited companies bit. I think that's probably a sensible thing to have a look at. But if there's no other questions, I'll thank you all for coming. Hope the rest of your day goes well, and hopefully see you next time around. Thank you.